For a long time, the energy argument stopped me. Not from buying Bitcoin. I had already done that. But from feeling fully comfortable defending it. Because when someone said Bitcoin wastes enormous amounts of energy, I did not have a good answer. The numbers sounded large. The criticism sounded reasonable. And I had absorbed the mainstream framing without really examining it. Then I started asking better questions, and the picture that emerged was completely different from the one I had been given. I'm Sat, and this is what I found when I stopped accepting the energy argument at face value. Let me start with the criticism as it is usually made, because it deserves a fair hearing before the response. Bitcoin mining uses a lot of electricity. Estimates place Bitcoin's annual energy consumption somewhere in the range of major countries. That sounds alarming. If you frame it as a currency that uses as much electricity as Argentina to process transactions, the implicit comparison is to Visa or MasterCard, which process vastly more transactions for a fraction of the energy. The conclusion seems obvious. Bitcoin is inefficient and wasteful. I held that framing for longer than I should have, because it is the framing that gets repeated most often, and repetition creates the feeling of settled fact. Here is the first question I started asking. What kind of energy are we talking about? Not all energy is equal in terms of its cost to the world. Energy that would otherwise be wasted is categorically different from energy that displaces other uses. And Bitcoin mining has an unusual and underappreciated relationship with wasted energy. Bitcoin miners need cheap electricity to be profitable. The cheapest electricity in the world is electricity that would otherwise go unused. Stranded energy. Hydroelectric power in remote regions where there is no population to consume it. Natural gas that would otherwise be flared, burned off at oil wells because it is too expensive to transport and too wasteful to simply release. Geothermal energy in locations far from population centers. Wind and solar generation during off-peak hours when the grid cannot absorb it. Bitcoin miners go to this energy because it is cheap. The consequence is that they are monetizing energy that would otherwise be lost. A gas flare that would have released carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere gets converted into Bitcoin instead. A hydroelectric dam in a remote Icelandic valley that could never power a city can now power a mining operation. The energy is not being taken from somewhere else. It is being used where it would otherwise be wasted. This is not the whole picture. Some Bitcoin mining does use energy from fossil fuel sources on conventional grids. The industry is not purely renewable, and it would be dishonest to claim it is. But the direction of travel is significant. The economic incentives of mining actively push it toward the cheapest energy sources, and the cheapest sources in the world are increasingly renewable. The second question I started asking was the comparison question. Compared to what? The implicit comparison in most energy criticism is to a world where Bitcoin does not exist and the financial system continues as it is. But that comparison ignores what the existing financial system actually costs. Banks run buildings. They run server farms. They power ATM networks, branch offices, armored vehicles, data centers, and the enormous physical and digital infrastructure of traditional finance. Estimates of the global banking system's energy use consistently place it significantly higher than Bitcoin's. Gold mining, which Bitcoin is often compared to as a store of value, uses substantial energy and also has significant water use and environmental disruption from physical extraction that Bitcoin does not. The comparison is never made on equal terms in mainstream coverage. Bitcoin's energy use is presented in isolation. The energy use of the systems it competes with is not mentioned. The third question was the most important one. What does the energy buy? Energy is not inherently good or bad. It is a resource. Whether its use is justified depends on what it produces. Christmas lights use energy. Medical equipment uses energy. The internet uses energy. We do not ask whether these uses are wasteful in isolation. We ask whether the value produced justifies the cost. Bitcoin's energy use buys a monetary network that operates without a central authority. One that cannot be shut down by a government, inflated by a central bank, or frozen by a financial institution. One that allows anyone with internet access to store and transfer value without permission from any institution. One that provides a fixed and verifiable monetary base that no committee can vote to change. Whether you believe that is worth the energy cost is a values question, not a physics question. But it is the right question to ask, and it is almost never asked in mainstream coverage of Bitcoin's energy use. There is one more aspect of this worth understanding: Bitcoin mining as a grid balancing tool. Electrical grids have a fundamental problem. Supply and demand for electricity fluctuate constantly, but generators cannot always be turned on and off instantly. During periods of excess supply, energy is either wasted or the generator has to be throttled back, which is inefficient and costly. During periods of high demand, grids can be strained. Bitcoin miners are uniquely flexible energy consumers. They can turn operations on and off almost instantly. During periods of excess grid supply, miners can absorb that surplus. During periods of high demand, miners can curtail operations immediately, freeing capacity for other users. This controllable demand is genuinely valuable to grid operators and is being actively used in Texas and other regions as a mechanism to stabilize the grid. Far from being a burden on the energy system, Bitcoin mining is increasingly functioning as a buyer of last resort for surplus energy and a flexible demand resource that improves grid stability. This is almost entirely absent from mainstream coverage of Bitcoin's energy use. I am not telling you that energy criticism is completely wrong. Some Bitcoin mining does use fossil fuels on conventional grids. The industry's environmental footprint is not zero and should continue to improve. But the framing of Bitcoin as an environmental disaster is not honest. It cherry-picks the worst examples, ignores the best, makes no comparison to competing systems, and asks none of the important questions about what the energy produces. When I started asking those questions, my view changed. Not because I wanted it to, because the evidence pointed somewhere different from where the mainstream narrative had led me. So, here is what to take away from this. The energy criticism of Bitcoin is real, but the mainstream framing of it is incomplete. Bitcoin mining has strong economic incentives to seek out the cheapest energy in the world, which is increasingly stranded, wasted, and renewable energy that would otherwise be unused or lost. The comparison is never made on equal terms. The banking system, gold mining, and other financial infrastructure use significant energy that is never placed alongside Bitcoin's in the same discussion. The right question is not, does Bitcoin use energy? It is, what does that energy buy? A decentralized, censorship-resistant, fixed supply monetary network is the answer. Whether that is worth the cost is a values question, but it deserves to be asked honestly. Bitcoin mining is also increasingly functioning as a grid stabilization tool, absorbing excess energy during surplus periods and curtailing instantly during demand spikes. The honest picture is more complicated than either Bitcoin critics or Bitcoin maximalists usually present, but it is considerably more favorable to Bitcoin than mainstream coverage suggests. If you want to understand what Bitcoin actually is and why it was designed the way it was, the video on why Bitcoin has value covers the foundation that makes this whole discussion make sense. Watch that next. Stack smart, stay curious. See you in the next stack.